Just take me through what you guys are reporting.
Sure. As the January 6th committee is going through all of this evidence they're getting in, more than 850 witnesses have sat for interview so far. One thing that they've begun to discuss is not just recommendations for changing the Electoral Count Act, which has been widely reported because Donald Trump and his allies tried to exploit that statute to have him stay in power. But now they're looking at whether or not there needs to be changes to the Insurrection Act as well. And that's for a few reasons. One, Donald Trump repeatedly threatened to use the Insurrection Act in ways many people found disturbing in 2020. And then in the final days of his presidency, extremists were urging him to invoke the Insurrection Act to stay in power. Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, wrote an open letter urging the invocation of the Insurrection Act, and other extremists, other Oath Keepers were chatting amongst themselves on text groups and on Facebook Messenger about anticipating the invocation of martial law when they would then come into the Capitol on January 6th. So the committee is gathering this evidence, and they're saying, we came very dangerously close here, and does this law need to be changed? I think there's debate on both sides of that, but perhaps some believe there should be a consultation with Congress before a president can invoke the act. Perhaps there needs to be a stronger definition before a president can invoke the act, and these are the discussions that are ongoing right now.
Well, Carolina, your book reports that the extremists weren't the only people checking social media about Donald Trump's sort of state of mind about the Insurrection Act. And I Alone Can Fix It, you write this. General Milley told his staff that he believed Trump was stoking unrest, possibly in hopes of an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act and call out the military. The night of January 2nd, Milley got a heads up from a former defense secretary that all 10 living former defense secretaries had reached the same conclusion. Because Milley was on high alert about January 6th, he had been monitoring DataMiner, an app that tracks specific news reports or Twitter alerts on subjects of one's choosing. Milley was checking it several times a day, looking for any sign of electoral protest, plans for civil unrest, or nutty calls for martial law that Mike Flynn may have stirred up. The general knew that a small spark could set off a blaze. So this isn't just a concern of the 1-6 committee. This was a concern at the highest levels of the U.S. military.
Absolutely, Nicole. And, what we've learned in our reporting around the time of that book was that Mark Milley told confidants that when Michael Flynn, remember, President Trump's most loyal enabler and the person who used to be his national security advisor until he had to be fired in disgrace for lying to the FBI and facing possible criminal liability, that there were shivers going through the Defense Department, sort of the brass, because on December 17th and 16th, Michael Flynn was publicly saying that the President of the United States should invoke the Insurrection Act, declare martial law, and quote unquote rerun the election by seizing the machines, voting machines, and basically in all swing states just running it over again. This is the kind of thing you hear in countries where dictators are in charge. And that's why people like Mark Milley, but many others in the Pentagon, Nicole, were on tenterhooks worrying about this. And I should argue that they were not ill-advised in being worried about just Michael Flynn's public commentary on a conservative news site. They had personally experienced Donald Trump's repeated efforts to pressure them to say it's time now to invoke the Insurrection Act. Keep in mind, Donald Trump, throughout the summer of unrest over the killing of George Floyd by police, he had said, look, this is a way for me to look strong. I'm going to come out against these Black Lives Matters protesters, and I'm going to look tough. And the Insurrection Act is the way to do that. Mark Esper basically threw his body in front of that. Mark Milley threw his body in front of that. Mark Esper being, of course, the former defense secretary, and at the time publicly was so upset about it, he gave a news conference infuriating the president by saying that he was opposed to the use of the Insurrection Act. I think Luke's right in describing that there's two views on all of this now about whether or not the panel that's investigating the insurrection should or should not recommend changes to when a president can invoke the act, because you can take away really important power from a responsible president while trying to take power out of the hands of a potential future rogue president.
It's such a fascinating balance to watch them try to strike. And Luke, my question, I guess in normal times would seem irrelevant, but is this bipartisan? I mean, are the Republicans for this too? Do the Republicans recognize how close Mark Esper and Mark Milley, not exactly, leftists in any of these political conversations, even as they get perverted on the right, do the Republicans understand there's a problem here? Are they participating in any efforts to tweak the act itself?
I'm told that any recommendation that comes out of the committee will be a unanimous one, so they will reach an agreement. There were diverging views on the committee when this matter came up in 2020. There were some Republican votes. Well, there was one Republican vote for reforming the Insurrection Act, and there were a handful of Democrats who voted against a change to it when it was on the floor of the House. That said, the end of the Donald Trump presidency presented new dangers in the minds of many that were not present for that vote. When you think about Mike Flynn, Sidney Powell, and others sitting in the Oval Office advocating for the seizure of voting machines, and we know from reporting that Donald Trump tried several different avenues to see if different agencies would be willing to seize voting machines. The Trump presidency presented new troubles for democracy that probably were not anticipated for previous presidents. So you have a set of laws here and a person who doesn't necessarily fit the normal mode of a presidency. So it is a difficult question for Congress. How do you legislate to try to ensure something like this doesn't happen again, especially if Donald Trump is returned to office?